Hey everyone, my name is Willa. I'm the head of marketing for the Collapse Survivor app, and this podcast covers day 3 of our U.S. Civil War scenario. I've got one of our staff survival experts with us today, Colonel Drew Miller, who is the head of Fortitude Ranch Survival Community, and a special guest expert, Drew, will introduce coming up just a bit. We're going to cover the third day's developments in this podcast, election violence in the 2024 POTUS election. We're going to deal with several prepper topics today, including dealing with possible Civil War violence, gun ownership, and home defense. Our guest is a leading prepper podcaster. Since the first rule of prepping many follow is don't tell anyone you're a prepper, he goes by the name of Pinball. And Colonel Miller has been on Pinball's show, so we'll let Colonel Drew introduce Pinball.
Thank you, Willa. It's great to have you on our show today, a great prepper expert, and want to introduce Pinball. And of course, preppers, we all know the first rule of prepping is don't tell when you're a prepper, so this is not uncommon to have someone who goes by a made-up name, not their real name. So Pinball was an ex-Army interrogator, and we all thank you for your military service. We had another Army person on yesterday. We had a Vietnam veteran, retired 2-star general on yesterday's podcast. And Pinball is a constitutionalist, meaning that he actually follows and respects the Constitution and the true meaning of the Constitution. And most probably 90% of Americans don't realize that the Supreme Court does not follow the Constitution because the judges are selected by Congress, and the vast majority of congressmen are career politicians, and they do want to violate the 9th and the 10th Amendments. They don't want the limits on power that the Constitution imposes. So a judge who vowed to respect the 9th and 10th Amendment would not get appointed to be a justice today. Pinball's been a prepper for over a decade, and his YouTube channel, which you can see up here, Pinball Preparedness that he hosts, gets hundreds of thousands of views, great preparedness and survival advice. Do you want to say an intro word here before we jump in?
I think you pretty much covered who I am, Colonel, but thank you there. But appreciate you guys having me on board here. I know we've been working together for, at least better part of a year at least. But honored to be invited onto the podcast with you guys.
Well, welcome to our Civil War. It's now day 3 of our Civil War. It's actually election day in this scenario. And Harris has been up in the polls when we started out, and that has scared a lot of states. Polling in Texas in our scenario showed that up to 70% of Texans said that if the Democrats win, they want to leave because the Democrats are especially at the forefront of violating the Constitution, not limiting the federal government. And so Texas and many other conservative states are saying if the Democrats win, we are out because they violate the Constitution. But the Trump is not listed in the Constitution. Those natural rights are still there, and government cannot violate them. That's the 9th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment is even more crystal clear. It says, unless the Constitution says the federal government can do something, it cannot. So federal government can do a post office. They can raise an army. They can conduct foreign policy. They can settle trade disputes between states, not within them, but between them. But beyond that, they cannot do things. So healthcare is just absolutely, completely unconstitutional. The Obamacare and all those programs.
And the one time that we've seen the Supreme Court actually follow the 10th Amendment was with the Roe versus Wade decision, where they gave that back to the states. They need to start realizing that there's a whole lot more that, and you mentioned healthcare, which is another big one, that the federal government was not supposed to be superior to the states. They were supposed to work in conjunction. That was the thing. And, just because Kamala Harris wants to make abortion legal everywhere, that's not the federal government does not have that legal right to do that.
Correct. And if you want to change the Constitution, you can. You can pass an amendment. For example, I would support an amendment to say the federal government can regulate environmental pollution that has impact outside of a state and international environmental issues. They don't have the power to do that now. We've got environmental regulations. They're unconstitutional. I would like to have some controls over people releasing pollution that can give me cancer and kill me. But until you amend the Constitution, it's unconstitutional. But in our campaign, that happens, where the Trump GOP campaign says we're going to enforce and follow the Constitution. And so they get a lot of support. They get libertarian support, they get a lot of independents, and then some conservatives who have not been backing Trump because they don't like him personally do jump on for support, because as a true conservative, you have to respect the Constitution, and thus they jump on the campaign. The other thing that happens is that the Libertarian candidate, Chase Oliver, drops out of the race, endorses the GOP Trump Libertarian Alliance, which they start calling the Constitutional Alliance. And in our scenarios, we always stress that they're realistic. And there's some quotes in here from Lincoln, and they're not fabricated, they're real. Lincoln definitely did say that the people have the right to revolt or succeed if a clearly written constitutional right has been violated. That's what he said in his first inaugural address. And his argument against the Confederacy was, we did not violate your constitutional rights. You don't have a right to succeed. But it's important to me to point out that Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Madison, the father of the Constitution, so many of our founding fathers have made it clear that we have a right to succeed as states. We have a right as citizens to disobey unconstitutional laws when they do violate the Constitution. And because of this momentum in the campaign, Trump wins up support, retakes the lead in the campaign. And again, it's election day in our scenario today. And the other interesting thing that goes on in a couple message traffic items is RFK Jr., who is campaigning for Trump, makes a lot of headway, not just with independents, but with some Democrats, by arguing that, hey, look, if you stop big government at the federal level, stop big government at the state level, then if you want to have a liberal government, you can do it at the local level. If the people there all support it and it's not dictated by Washington, D.C. or state government. So it's not just, conservatives who would like constitutional limits. It would actually benefit a lot of liberal folks who want to have real diversity and local governments able to do what they want. So as a result of that, the campaign momentum is now on the Trump side as election day starts.
I'll give you one point, and people have to remember that when the Constitution was written, the country obviously was very different. Okay, I mean, we're talking about 13 states versus 50. But if you go back just a couple of generations, and both of you can probably agree with me and have similar experience here, families used to live, birth to death, cradle to grave, in the same area. And, you married the girl down the streets, and the family was there. Our family's been in this town for, 150 years. Now you look at the mobility of people. And I mean, my family's small. I mean, bloodline, there's all of 6 of us. And of the 6 of us, we are spread between Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, and Tennessee. Okay. People can move where they want to be. So where it comes to states' rights, people have, where they didn't 250 years ago, really have the ability to move somewhere that was more in line with their beliefs. They kind of towed the line. Now people can go. If you, again, believe in, you're pro-life or pro-choice, you can be somewhere there. If you want, as you just said, that liberal government, there's no problem with you going there. It's very easy for people to, comparatively, very easy for people to move. I've moved all over this country. If you want more conservative values for your kids, church and et cetera, you can go to those places. It wasn't the same 250 years ago, but now it's relatively easy for people to do that. And why we have all these issues. Drew, you and I know, I've talked about this before. I don't see the United States making it as a one country till by 2050 easy. We will have broken up in probably 5 or 6 different countries by then.
We're getting into that later on in this.
Yeah.
The Democratic Party platform calls for a ban on what they call assault weapons or military capable weapons. And as folks on the show know, AR and AR-15 does not stand for assault rifle. It is an abbreviation of a company name, Armalite. We did a poll in the simulation asking whether or not if you had an AR-15 or similar weapon and such a ban became law, would you follow it? And we won't have the poll results until the scenario ends later this week, and it'll be covered in our last podcast. But I wanted to ask what % of AR-15 or similar weapons owned would follow a ban if it did become law, despite the Second Amendment?
Well, first I'm going to ask. They call it a military weapon, and every time somebody throws that one at me, the first thing I challenge them to do: show me one military in the world that uses an AR-15. You can't, because nobody does. Okay, it is not a military weapon. They cannot define what an assault weapon is. It's a scary black rifle. That's it. It's a
an AK-47 in the failed assassination attempt the other day wasn't an AR-15.
Right. Well, that was the other thing. This will tell you how incompetent the politicians are. It wasn't even an AK-47. It was an SKS.
I thought it was. Oh, they said it was an AK-47.
So they can't even name the right rifle. I mean, let alone the 50 caliber clips and fires 1,000 rounds a minute, or all the other lies that they come up with. But as to your question, what percentage do I think would turn in their weapons? I'll bet it's less than 5.
That'd be my guess too. I mean, I've run in. Well, we'll get into this in the kind of second part of the poll question. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Not many people who own these weapons are going to be willing to, even if they ignored the Second Amendment or passed an amendment repealing the Second Amendment, I still don't think they would turn them in.
No, and it goes right back as why was the Second Amendment written in the first place? It wasn't so we could go out plinking at the range or go out hunting deer. It was to protect ourselves from a tyrannical government.
That's true. And the other reason I think you do need these weapons, I mean, even if you absolutely adored your government, I would still want the weapons. And the reason is a marauder attack and a collapse when there's no law and order. And I've got a gang. I don't have, one criminal breaking into my house or 2 guys breaking into my house. I've got a gang that may have 12, 25, 30 people coming at me. If I don't have the kind of clip that I'm not allowed to have in Colorado, with 30 rounds in it, I don't have a chance. I need military capable weapons. I need high capacity clips. Otherwise, I'm going to be killed. So marauding and collapse does make the case for these, quote, military capable weapons.
I just did a video this morning with the story of one of my subscribers who had a carload of 7 or 8 illegals come up to their house trying to convince them to come to the car to look at the surprise cleaning supplies they had. Okay, you have a man and a woman, older, let's put it that way, up against 7 or 8 military age males with all the problems that we have right now with the border. Hand-to-hand combat's not happening. You need an equalizer.
The double-barrel shotgun is fun for hunting. I had one when I was a kid, but if there's a marauder attack or a big group of people, I'm sorry, my double-barrel shotgun isn't enough. I do need to have an AR-15 or something like that.
Correct.
For people in the poll who answered that they would not obey a ban, if the Democratic Party called for all of their assault weapons and would keep their weapons, then we asked them if they would turn it in if they were caught. What is your best estimate of how many Americans who own an AR-15 or similar weapon would turn them in, and what percentage would fight if necessary to keep them?
I still go back to what I said before. Less than 5% would turn them in, and the remaining 95% would fight to keep them. Because once we give it, I mean, the Second Amendment is the only thing that stands between worldwide global tyranny and freedom. That's it. Because the rest of the world has decided, gee, the people just can't. We need our government to protect us, and Americans are like, not happening.
In this simulation, we got into determining home break-ins and home defense. As a prepper expert, we'll ask you first, what are the best ways to deter home break-ins?
Simple things. The best thing you can do is to make sure that the bad guy passes your house and goes down the street. Now, if we're talking about a full-blown SHTF situation, maybe, and I've talked about this before, maybe you do something silly like put quarantine tape around your house. Okay, that might be an idea right there. Somebody, hey, we're not going into that place. Doesn't matter. Okay, you know what it's safe or not. But in a regular time period like now, the best thing you can do is use the term gray man, is just look like you don't have a lot of high value stuff in the house. But again, like we talked about before, bad guys are going to come in. They're not necessarily going after TVs and computers. They're looking for guns, for example. Those are something, those are things that they want to get. So, you don't want to advertise what you have.
You didn't plug your dogs while you had the opportunity.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, dogs are another good one to make keep people away.
I guess that you already answered my next question. Then, what do you believe is the best weapon for home defense?
Okay, no, that one I certainly haven't answered, because that is there is no best weapon for home defense. It depends on the person, because if you live in an apartment complex, or if you live in a suburban neighborhood, or if you live in a rural area, big difference. I mean, I don't necessarily want an AR-15 if I'm living in an apartment, because I'm going to put that round through 4 different apartments if it goes through. Now, other things that you come into play is how maneuverable are you in your space? Do you have narrow hallways? You don't want necessarily a weapon that's 3 feet long to move through. Do you want a shotgun? Oh, okay. Well, birdshot, buckshot. What's your intention? Again, we all know this. A pistol's best use is to get you to your rifle. But if you were talking about close quarters in your house, I don't want to be moving around with something that is, I'm going to bang into a wall. So there is no real good answer for best weapon for home defense.
I do tend to favor the 12 gauge shotgun and probably a pump, just because it's more reliable, and definitely want multiple rounds. You take out the government plug in there, so you've got 2 more shots there. But again, you also the personnel factors. Well, you might be a little bit small, for a 12 gauge. That might be a little bit more bang than you could handle. But for me, I like them for one of the reasons you mentioned. So it's not going to necessarily go through the whole house. And then the biggest factor is just so I could be shaking. Someone could be shaking, scared, and you're more likely to hit someone shooting a shotgun than you are an AR-15 or something, and definitely with the pistol. But there are a lot of factors to consider, and that's why we've asked this question in other variants and other scenarios, and there is no right or wrong answer. Yeah. But it's something you want to consider and think through and research.
Yeah, and even then with the shotgun, at inside somebody's house, I mean, unless of course you're living in a mansion somewhere, the spread that you're going to get is not much more than maybe about 9 inches at 20 yards tops.
While these scenarios are simulated and not real news, they are based on real threats and conditions, and the survey data that you see here is real. 50% of Americans polled expect a civil war because our nation is so divided, and that's the basis of this scenario. Pinball, you follow threats in the news carefully from a preparedness perspective, so 2 questions for you. First, do you think a civil war is likely? And 2, what kind of civil war would that be?
I mean, and that's such a difficult question, because everybody tries to compare it to 1860, and it's not like you're going to have, rebels versus Yankees and everybody in uniform. People, you hear all the time, oh, it's going to be conservatives versus liberals. All right, everybody's not going to go out and put on blue T-shirts or red T-shirts. It's just so you're not going to know who the quote-unquote enemy is. Then you hear the people talk about, well, it's going to be a racial thing. Well, okay, is it going to be blacks against whites, or Hispanics against Asians, or blacks against Asians? Or who's going to take on what side? Do you know? So if there's any sort of civil war, it's going to be very, very localized, and you're not going to have some sort of national scenario. It's not going to work that way. What will wind up happening if we ever got to that point is you're going to have, and I'll just use the term, tribal warfare. That's what it's going to be. And then after that is done and each particular group takes over a town or whatever, then it's going to spread a little bit more. But I can't tell you what it's going to be like. The only thing I can tell you is it's going to start small. It's not going to be red versus blue or black versus white.
In the this is actually the second Civil War simulation that's been run. In the earlier one, the Democrats won, and Texas succeeded. Some other states followed them out, and it was basically not violent. Texas negotiated with the federal government to even keep bases in Texas. Why not? There's U.S. bases all over the world. Texas could be a foreign country and have U.S. forces stationed there, as long as you're allied at that level. This one is different. It's more like you described it. I'm a bit of a spoiler alert here. Don't stop watching if you don't want me to ruin the next few days of the scenario. But what happens is Trump does win the election, and a lot of the liberal big government states, California, Illinois, Oregon, Nevada, Colorado, Massachusetts, they start splitting up because the rural counties basically say, we're through with this. We're through with your unconstitutional big government laws violating our private property, violating our privacy, our personal natural rights, and they start splitting up. But it is very much local, as you said, it's county succeeding. And when we really have that to some degree now in the United States with the Second Amendment. Last I saw was that most county sheriffs refuse to enforce gun laws because they say they violate the Second Amendment. So you've got some degree of civil war going on now. It's just not violent. But after a new administration takes over, vowing to enforce the Ninth and 10th Amendments, and now there's more push for, protecting your constitutional rights. A lot of rural conservative counties in big government-controlled states that the liberal governments control, they basically do say, that's it, we're no longer obeying your state laws. And some violence does break out, but very much at the local level.
And you can go back to 2020 and look at that when you had Chaz and Chop and Kenosha and Minneapolis and those kind of
Portland.
Yeah, that's how things are going to play out. And when you talk about balkanization, okay, Washington, Oregon, California, that may become a country. You may have, Wisconsin, Minnesota, maybe Chicagoland, possibly Michigan. You may have a upper Midwest country, obviously Northern New England, you're going to have that. But I mean, if Texas goes, you can figure the rest of the Southeast is going with it. Entire, all of middle America is going to be like, okay, we want to go too. That would be, you probably wind up with one huge conservative state and 3 or 4 smaller liberal states if we had any sort of separation, if you will, of the country.
Yeah, it's an urban-rural split. We discussed that in yesterday's podcast. It really is an urban-rural divide more than anything else because the urban tends to be more liberal, more Democratic Party controlled. Rural tends to be more conservative, more libertarian, more Republican.
Yeah, and if you break that down, look at the 2020 election. Trump won 497 counties, and Biden won 477. So you start talking about landmass, and then we can go into this for hours. Good luck for all those urban areas feeding themselves. Food doesn't grow that. You're not going to grow that much food in Central Park in New York.
Yeah, our Fortitude Ranch locations were all rural, and I'm sure you're rural there too. You don't want to be surviving in a big city.
No.
The rest of the message items shown here from the Civil War simulation is cut off, but let me read some of it here for you. The University of California's survey found that 42% of owners in what they call assault-type rifles believe political violence could be justified. This was a higher percentage than non-gun owners. This feeds more concern that violence post-election could happen. My guess is most gun owners are more likely to support Trump. Pinball, do you have any feel for whether or not gun owners are more likely to engage in civil war violence or just more likely to defend their property?
Both. Certainly defend their property. You're going to have the blue party, if you will, trying to take your property, and you're not just going to defend it up to the property line. At that point, you're going to try to push them back.
So this is kind of another example of urban-rural split. It shows where is gun ownership. And if you'll notice, if you're looking at a city, about 1/4 of urban households have weapons. You go out to the country, most of them have weapons in the household, and the suburbs are in between at 41%. So again, the split here, as we've talked about, really is more urban-rural. liberal in the cities, Democratic controlled in the cities, and more rural, more conservative, more libertarian, and Republican in the countryside. And so, again, that is your split. It's less between states than it is between the big cities and the liberals and the more urban, rural, conservative folks. Statistics that, of course, don't have in this, that would be interesting, is what percent of criminals versus non-criminals have guns? That would be a revealing statistic, but I'm not sure how the University of Pew Research Center here would collect that data.
Right, yeah, because criminals are always so forthcoming with telling you what they have.
You control whether or not you want new information that comes into the Collapse Survivor app to alert you via your phone or not bother you. For example, if you want to get notified of new preparedness news items, turn the notification on for news. If you want to get a notice every time there is a new message out and a live play exercise, have that notification turned on. But if you don't want to be bothered with notification alerts, then go to the app settings, turn off the notifications. They are optional to alert you or not to everything except the real threat alerts. If there's a serious disaster threat alert pending, the Collapse Survivor app will push out an alert to your phone and you should immediately read it. We do not allow disabling of real threat alert notifications. They could save your life, but every other app function has normal notification options. So turn them on or off as you choose. Tomorrow, we will have a report on our day 4 of the Civil War scenario with more insights on how a civil war could unfold in the U.S. and how you can be more prepared to deal with the violence that may result from this. Pinball, thank you so much for coming on today's show. I greatly appreciate it. And thank you so much for your service.
Thank you for having me.